you're building an app, there are 6 crucial things that most founders don't discover until it's too late. Now, I've spent 15 years in tech helping apps reach #1 on the App Store and get millions of downloads at launch. And I keep seeing founders make these same expensive mistakes over and over. So today I'm showing exactly what they are, how to spot them early so you can launch your app faster and smarter. Let's go. So the first thing to keep in mind is that Android and iOS are actually 2 very different platforms. And with that comes 2 very different types of technologies. I touch on this in my other videos about full stack development and front-end versus back-end, but typically speaking, on Android, you're using different programming languages than you do on iOS. Not just that, but you have different building blocks and tools available to you as a programmer to build an app. Therefore, experience really matters. Now, why does that impact you as a founder? Well, typically speaking, if you're imagining your app to be launched on both platforms at the same time, you're basically building the same thing from scratch twice. Now that is costly in terms of time as well as money. Now, you will have heard of different things like React Native and progressive web apps, which I'll touch upon a bit later in the video. But you're right, there are different pieces of technology nowadays that allows you to kind of make an app once and put it on both platforms. However, there's still a lot of fine-tuning you need to do towards the end to make sure that it works for each platform. The other thing as well is that you'll notice there's quite different costs associated with your choice in platform. Typically speaking, iOS development is more expensive, but it does go a little bit quicker than Android development. That's because with Android, there's a lot more testing that you need to do. There's tons of different devices, tons of different versions of the operating system, and there are more bugs that tend to creep up. All of this takes time to iron out. Whereas with iOS, it's a little bit more streamlined. So whilst there's a higher cost per day, if you will, the overall project tends to be a bit shorter. And with an Android project, you have a bit of a longer project where the day rate might be a little bit lower. At the end of the day, I'd say that prices are fairly similar. It's just the case that you don't want to be doing work twice. So what I recommend is for you to go where your people are. Do some early research to figure out where most of your users or intended customers are hanging out. Do they mostly have iPhones or do they mostly have Android devices? And if you absolutely cannot choose between the 2 because, for example, you're working on a medical app, which means everyone kind of needs it and you can't really distinguish or discriminate even, there are some other options you have, but really talk it through with your developers so that there's a clear action plan in terms of deployment and which one you might be piloting first, even if it's staggering it with a few weeks. If you do have the option to work on one platform first, I really recommend that because not only are you saving costs, what's going to happen is you're going to start with one. And from that one, you're going to learn exactly which features people use most, which things need changing. And then when it comes time to duplicate it onto the other platform, it will go so much faster. Because otherwise, you're just making the same mistake twice on both platforms and it's going to cost you double. So start with one, learn from one, and then duplicate onto the other platform. The other thing to keep in mind that tends to bite founders in the behind, if you will, in projects is that your app needs to be ready before you need it. There tends to be a lot of time towards the tail end of an app project that a lot of founders have not budgeted for. Here's why. Typically speaking, there is a thorough review process that happens. So when you submit your app to the Google Play Store or to the Apple App Store, there are real humans that will take that submission and look at your app, test your app, and typically speaking, they almost always send you feedback because you'll need to change a couple of things or there's bits and bobs in their terms and conditions that you may not have completely realized. And so they'll ask for requests for changes. This takes time, you have to then re-upload it, resubmit it, and it's not until they give you the golden stamp of approval that you are live and available in the App Store. And this can take about 1 to 2 weeks. Now, even worse, if you again have a regulatory product like a medical product or things like that, you might even need to show certain proof. You might need to show that you've done research and studies, double-blind controlled studies. And so you need to package up your app with lots of supporting documents to make sure that the review process goes as smoothly as possible. This can take 3 to 4 weeks. And so making sure that you have enough padding and enough time before you are promising to your customers and your users that your app's going to be live is going to be really, really important. It's also something you want to budget for, because when you potentially get those change requests back, you will need some development efforts to be put towards that to fix those snags. Typically speaking, and especially if you're working with an agency, that should be included in the process, but just bear that in mind. Now, I'd factor in a little bit more time even if you're thinking of doing a beta, which I'd highly recommend, which leads me to point number 3. You want to start building a beta test list. Even if you're doing a pilot, it could be people in your company, in your local community, it could be the investors or the board, because the thing is, apps are buggy. Like, it's an interesting mix of combinations where some people have this device, or they have that version of the operating system installed, or they just do a combination of clicks that you did not anticipate when you were building it. And that means the app crashes, which is rather unfortunate if that would be happening to your everyday customers. And so it's really crucial to spend about 2 weeks or so having 10, 15, 20 folks try it out and test your app properly on their own devices so that you can find all these bugs and all these snags to at least give it a bit of polish. Typically speaking as well, in that submission process that I spoke about earlier, Apple or Google will reject your app if it crashes too much. And so snagging these bugs early on is really helpful. Now, how do you do that? Especially when you're saying, you know what, Maxime, there's this app submission process, so there's a chicken, there's the egg, how do I do that? What comes before what? How do I get my test app into the hands of people? Well, it's great that both Apple and Google have a solution for that. If you've ever tested an app, you might be familiar with something called Test Flight. Through the Apple system, you can then list everyone that you want to have early access to your app. You can deploy it specially through that process to those people. There's still a tiny review process involved, but it's much easier, and that way you can get folks to test it out early. And Google offers the exact same thing through the Google Play console. And so think about adding another 2 weeks or so in your project planning to ensure that you've got folks trying out your app early on. This is also good for getting them to submit reviews. It's good for getting the ball rolling of people, downloading and trying your app in general. And so building a beta list and having a review process is a great thing to do, and something that most founders tend to overlook. Now, the other thing to keep in mind that some folks forget about are the fees associated with deploying your product on these different stores. Now, first and foremost, there are just platform fees. And so for you to list your app on the Apple App Store, you need to be paying $99 per year to just have your developer account. If you have an enterprise license, which is a specialized different form of license, it's $299. But in most cases, you'll be having a regular Apple developer license fee, and that is $100 a year. Google, quite a bit cheaper. It's a one-off fee of $25, and that allows you to be on the Google Play Store. Now, the biggest thing though that catches people off guard, that can be quite pricey, is that these stores take a commission, if you will. They take a fee for every digital purchase that ends up happening through your platform. Let me explain. So if you were to sell an in-app purchase, so you'll unlock a bunch of features for a certain subscription, say, that counts as a digital product that you are then upselling someone into, right? If you have a membership to some content, so if you're thinking about all these meditation apps, if you want to have access to all the tapes and all the functionality and all the cool things, right, you pay a subscription fee. In each of these cases, Apple and Google will take 30% of the fee. So if your subscription is $9.99 a month, 30% of that, so $3, will go to Apple or Google, not to you. That's quite a shock for most folks when they find out the very first time. It's something that's been the case forever, and actually Epic Games contended this in 2020 when they sued Apple for this case, because they were selling, they're behind the popular Fortnite. Fortnite sells V-Bucks and skins and all these cool upgrades. All of those also count as digital goods or digital content that's being sold, right? And so they are spending a fortune giving back to Apple and Google for this. And they weren't happy about that. They took them to court. They didn't quite win, but there have been some changes off the back of that. So if your store revenue is less than $1 million per year, you can qualify for the, I believe it's called the Small Business Program, where you only have to pay 15%. So it's quite significantly reduced. There's also special cases if you are in the EU, and it can be reduced even to 10%, or with repeat subscriptions. So if someone is buying from you year after year, there's also a certain reduction there. So check out all the documentation if that applies to you. Now, this is of course different if you're selling physical products. So if you are thinking of, for example, Nike or Adidas or even Amazon, right? They've all got apps where you can buy physical products. In this case, you are not paying any of these commissions. But if you've ever wondered why you can't buy Kindle books in the Kindle app or on the Amazon app, that's why. It's also why these things act as a reader or a viewer. If you download Netflix, you can log in, and if you've got an account, you can see everything that you have, but you can't subscribe to Netflix using their app. It's because all of these things count as digital goods, and so these massive companies would be having to pay Apple and Google these massive fees, which they don't want to do. So make sure that it's something that you factor into your budget when you're thinking about putting your app together. The fifth thing most founders, especially actually non-technical founders, forget about are the maintenance costs associated with apps. Now, we all know there'll be a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of tinkering, but why are apps considerably more expensive in this case? Well, every year there's a new version of software that gets pushed to both iPhones and Androids, right? This is your iOS 15, 16, 17, 18. Every year there's something new, and it's the exact same with Android. And with that come new features, but also some things are deprecated. So building blocks that we've used when we put apps together are no longer available to us, and it kind of starts to crumble, and you get these really strange bugs that appear. You might also say there's this new feature coming out in the latest iOS that I really want to take advantage of. Well, that's a new building block, if you will, and so developers will need to play with that and figure that out, and then they can build that for you. And so every year, making sure that your app is still running on the latest software is quite important. And with that comes a little bit of maintenance cost that you will want to budget for. There's also this common misconception that building technology is a little bit like building a house. And once you've done it, it's standing there, it's a structure, you've got it, it's an asset that will last you for a very, very long time. Unfortunately, software is a little bit more ephemeral than that, and it's really like, yes, you've got something tangible, but rarely have I seen a code base last more than 3 years. Most of the time, especially in big companies, right, it gets rewritten and redone continuously. So once you've finished building the kitchen, you're working on the bathroom, then you're working on the bedroom, and then you go back to the kitchen and you basically redo the kitchen, and the loop starts again. Now, if you are a kind of small business owner or you're an early stage founder, this won't really be the case. What you've built should last you a little while, but typically speaking, there is a level of maintenance that you'll need to factor for. So keep that in mind. The sixth and final unknown that I want to talk to you about today are the options available to you. And so when I said at the beginning, most folks don't realize that actually creating an Android app and creating an iOS app are two quite separate things, and they can almost double the cost. It's something they weren't aware of. And so what are the options available to you when you're thinking about creating an app? Well, I put them in three kind of categories. So the first thing are the native apps. These are apps written using native technology, and so that's different for Android and iOS. On Android, you'd be using Kotlin or Java. On iOS, you're mostly using Swift. Objective-C used to be the case, but it's, no one starts an app with Objective-C anymore. And so you're using your native frameworks and native technology. These are completely not compatible across platforms. So whatever you're putting in one, you cannot use on the other. Now, a level or a step down from that is using cross-platform technology. So Flutter is an option, React Native is an option, and you've got these progressive web apps that you can also kind of wrap and use. Now, in this case, depending on the technology, it's not quite as simple as creating it once and then kind of pushing it to two things. Just like, for example, if you do any content creation, you might create a reel and you just put the reel on TikTok, or you put the TikTok on YouTube and it's done. It's not quite as simple. There is a little bit of faffing and a bunch of stuff that needs to be done to make sure it works on both cases. However, if you start with one, then you've got a code base that you can kind of reuse to, I'd say, about 80%, which is pretty good going. So start with one platform, create a bunch over there, and then port it over and take it over to the other platform if that's important to you. Now, the third option that most people actually don't know about is you can wrap any website into an app, if you will. And you can put some tabs at the bottom, or you can put some buttons around where you can access different parts of the website. And that way, you get this personal app experience, and it can feel like an app almost, but really under the hood, it's mostly a website. Now, why could this be a good thing? Well, if you're already creating a marketplace that's on the web, or you have a community on the web, for example, or you have an existing web product that you want to make available on the store, this is a really, really simple, quick, and very affordable option available to you. There are agencies that specialize in this, and so you can go and find those. If you have a developer, they can do it for you. If you have someone in-house that you're already working with, that's all possible. You'll have the same steps in terms of you need to then deploy the app to the store, it will get reviewed, you might get some feedback, etc., etc. But once that's all happened, you have an app on the store and most of the contents are actually web. What's handy about that as well is that when you make an update on the website, it will reflect live into the product straight away. Whereas sometimes when you want to update an app, you have to push the app update back to the store, get that submission approval, and then it's live to people. And even then, it's not live to folks straight away. They have to choose to update it first. I don't know if you remember this, but nowadays we have auto update. Most people have that switched on by default. But back in the day, you used to have to kind of manually click and update all the apps. So it could be that you've pushed all these new features, but there's still tons of users out there walking around with your old app version. Not the case if you've got a web app. So all this to say, you have different options available to you. Talk them through with your developers, your agencies, and don't just assume that one way is the best way, right? It really depends on your needs, your budget, and what you've already got to work with, and also where your users are. Now, I hope these 6 tips or common forgotten about things have given you a little bit more insight ahead of your app development. As I said, I've been working with apps for a long time. I created my first app in 2009. And the industry has changed a lot. There's a lot of things available nowadays that weren't back then. And so if you want more app tips, like for example, how to create a great onboarding, let me know, leave a comment below and I'll get right onto it. Good luck and I'll see you next time.